This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
You're listening to the Entrepreneur to Author podcast.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur to Author podcast, the podcast that brings you practical strategies for building authority and growing your business. And now, here's your host, Scott McMillan.
Today, my guest is an award-winning author and sustainable finance expert who discovered her passion for the science of impact while studying mathematics at Stanford University. Her work bridges the gap between sustainability, financial innovation, and risk-taking behaviors. She's the recipient of the 2019 Honoree Award from the Women's Venture Fund and of the 2021 Global Leadership Award by the She Inspires Foundation in the UK. A fellow of the Aspen Institute, she is an avid advocate of the role of impact science in business education, contributing to educational initiatives on the topic in the US, Asia Pacific, and Latin America. And she's also the author of the Impact Challenge, Reframing Sustainability for Business. Please join me in welcoming Alessia Falsarone to the show. Alessia, thank you so much for joining us.
Scott, it's wonderful to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So to start, I'd love if you could share a little bit about you and your professional journey for our audience so that they can get a bit better sense of where you're coming from. Sure.
So I would say that my journey, at least the past 25 years, have been spent half-half, on one hand, working with banking organizations around the globe, and the other half with investors in New York City. So when I look at that, though, it doesn't really tell them much about me, other than I can tell you more, which is I'm a strategist by trade, meaning I enjoy and earn a living thinking big picture, anticipating trends, and helping organizations financially find the best path to stability and growth. But I'm also a mathematician, as you said, by educational background, which leads me always to try and quantify even the most esoteric things and to be able to compare and analyze them. And therefore, not surprisingly, that my current work as an investor lies at the intersection of financial innovation and how it can build tools to fast-track companies, clearly in their need to adapt to something that from esoteric or one-off has become a strong need, climate change and sustainability. Whether companies are looking to fund environmentally friendly product offerings or their communities and social initiatives, or simply grow their shared responsibility and working collaboratively and transparently to achieve their sustainability goals.
Well, that's great. We love strategists, we love big picture thinkers, and we love data on the Entrepreneur to Author podcast. So you're in the right place. Your area of expertise is in sustainable finance, and you talk a lot about science of impact. Could you talk a little bit more about these? What do they mean in layman's terms?
Yeah, well, interesting, Scott. Sustainable finance to me is the new finance, and when I talk about it, I describe it as the field that encompasses all this set of regulations that are emerging around the world, which demand transparency over decision making of financial institutions, and also the creation of value for the longer term, not just for short-term profit. I also think personally it's more than that. I believe that as part of the broad economy, financial institutions, and whether they're banks or insurers or investors, play a tremendous role in growing the wealth of individuals, of countries in where they operate, but also that prosperity cannot be at the detriment of our planet and civil society. So when I hear sustainable finance, I think of all the individuals, especially the new generation of professionals that have either entered the workforce over the past, call it 3 to 4 years, or are looking from college days to start their professional journey, and that want to place their integrity, their values, their ability to grow, the shared prosperity the right way in the field of finance. Now, to your point on the science of impact, I discovered a passion for what I call the science of impact as a multidisciplinary field, a field that researches all those hard to quantify outcomes that businesses in particular and society are responsible for co-creating, and whether these are positive or negative. And that's an important component and a part that financial institutions have not necessarily taken a stand on prior to even our COVID days.
So one thing that I've always wondered, and this is a little bit off script, but I've always wondered what the common metric, or even if there is a common metric around things that are difficult to quantify. I recall in my years in management consulting, we always use dollars and cents as the common denominator, even when we're trying to value things that are intangible. Is that the metric that you use around science of impact, or do you look at it a different way?
So it's interesting you mentioned that, Scott, and I think that that's in fact the divide and the biggest challenge for individuals to actually go and approach impact and outcomes such as social value created by a company, or the environmental protection that a company is responsible for, or the adverse impacts of a company on the broader ecosystem. I think that people, especially in traditional businesses, struggle with the idea of how do we reconcile metrics that are dollar driven or currency sort of denomination driven or profit driven into something that is in completely different metric, right? So it's interesting also how the way a lot of organizations, especially non-for-profits that operate in the areas such as financial accounting, have started to articulate a set of standards where you look at metrics, yes, in terms of how much of all the resources that a business has access to, whether it's human capital resources or their resources drawn from the environment, are needed for a business or an organization to actually create value, if that value is in dollars, for example. So how much of your human capital is needed to create $1 worth of your good? And that's the intensity, right, of your production in a way. And that's just one way of looking at it, but it also tells you how much of those resources do you invest into or reinvest into. And so there's a series of metrics and tools that are becoming more and more utilized over time, and that companies in different sectors are starting to appreciate a lot more in trying to bridge the gap between only dollar denominated, again, discussions into there are resources that we're utilizing, and there's not necessarily manufactured goods or parts, or this is human capital, and there's talent in our business. There is part of the ecosystem we live in that obviously we draw resources, whether it's water usage, energy, or the likes, and how is the intense use of these resources not met by replenishing those resources, and should businesses actually be accounted for and held accountable for that? And I think the resounding answer to that globally that we're having is yes. We just have one world, and we are responsible for replenishing that, and it doesn't. We're not creating conditions for it to do it naturally, or it could do it naturally if we let it. And if we give enough time. So I think that common shared balance between, again, creating profits and understanding the utilization of resources when resources are limited, it's a shared responsibility of all. That sort of organizations are in need for more data, for the ability to share also the scientific methods that allow them to translate, right, one need, ecosystem need to the business day to day.
Very good. So that's a good transition. And so you've written your book, The Impact Challenge. Could you talk about who that book is written for, and what's the book's overarching message for its readers?
Yeah, so that's another interesting question, because it started actually with an audience in mind. It was an academic audience at the very beginning. And since its launch on Earth Day this year, the week of April 23rd, I'm finding more and more streams of audiences that had not been necessarily targeting to begin with, which is probably a dream come true for someone that writes their first book. But the audience I had in mind at the beginning, with the Impact Challenge being the first in an academic series called The Impactful Data Science, where the editor of that series is a global association called GRMDS, Global Association of Research Methods and Data Science. And they're connected over 40,000 data scientists globally and offer just continued practical training, what I call from the lab to industry, on creating, again, those set of tools and applications for data to become more available to solve business and societal issues. So from that perspective in mind, I had an academic, I was looking to bridge the gap in between how do we translate the concepts that go on and that get dissected in academia into making, bits of this information available as a stepping stone for businesses to actually implement sustainability programs in their day-to-day. On the other hand, I'm also finding that audience in the traditional business world that are not necessarily sitting in sustainability oriented roles are actually looking to get informed about data and about processes and about how the overall infrastructure of an organization needs to adapt to sustainability, whether they believe it or not, whether they believe in the need of it or not. So it's interesting. And that's where I say that the true challenge for organizations probably across the globe it really is. And it's simple. It's just getting started in an intentional and data-driven way that can be accomplished, again, grassroots at first, and then evolve to actually drive meaningful cultural change within a business.
It's funny, what you talked about around writing for one audience and then it having appeal across multiple audiences, that's something that I talk a lot about when I'm talking to people about how to approach writing their book. Because often, if you try to appeal to a bunch of different reader groups, the book will fall flat and it won't resonate with anybody. But if you really focus on one audience and try to resonate deeply with that audience, then it's funny how it then does resonate with people outside of that group. So it's really interesting to hear you say that. How did you find the writing process as you were writing the book?
It was a marathon when I look back at it. It was complete focus on the task at hand. And the good news is, or I don't know if it's the good news, but for me was I was following a traditional publishing journey. And so I had already a specific, for example, table of content and a development plan for my manuscript, which I had developed to get my idea through the publishing network. And it was quite a strict timeline allocated then to the follow-up of the actual writing. So what I'm getting at it is writing probably starts, in my experience, much, much earlier than actually when you put yourself, at the table and start, typing all your notes. I would say that when I mentioned it was a marathon, as I feel it, it helped in a way maintaining focus and taking it a step at a time. I also found out how many ideas I had accumulated and also how humbling it was to realize that my path and my journey is actually mine, but there are highlights that can benefit others in shaping their very own journey and experimenting with the topic of impact, and others that don't necessarily need to end up in the book. So the trimming part of the writing process was the hard part and the last few miles of the marathon, I believe.
And what about publishing? Was there anything that was you found maybe surprising or frustrating or particularly exciting about getting the book from manuscript into the hands of readers?
Yeah, so I'll start with the maybe surprising part. The surprising part was the ease of working with a global team. A team global from both the publisher perspective, both from the content definition and refining perspective. I had a network of and a team, as you know, that has worked across the globe on that, and so cross time zones. But also a network of people that were looking at my manuscript from a global perspective on a global problem, which is sustainability. And so I also got the, sort of off the record or one-off feedback from the actual people, not just them as a professionals, but people looking into this, from their own perspective, which was great, and it was probably my first readership, so to speak. So that was the surprising part. The Frustrating part, I would say, was I had a lot more and probably much more than material than for one book. I could have probably written like many volumes of this series. But again, the exciting part also was that this is part of a series. So I also felt at the beginning that was, being the first author of a series and being the series called Impactful Data Science, I was almost like, just given the chance to actually shed a, light over data science methods, but how those could advance, the work of so many that trying to do good in the world. So being the first was also being the pace setter for other proposals to follow to my publisher, and that was also like I found it exciting. Although I could sense, as I look back, that maybe there was also a component of feeling under pressure, to do an extremely good job at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did do an excellent job at it. But yeah, you're right. It can often be tempting to just cram everything that you could possibly want to publish into your first book. But like you say, there's always the opportunity to publish subsequent books. What are your goals personally and professionally for your book, and how are you using it to accomplish those?
Well, I have really one goal, which is essentially ensuring that there's a practical education surrounding big challenges that our world faces, and that practical education is easily accessible, and that misinformation is flagged and removed, and that anyone working in the private sector, whether for a large organization or a smaller scale one, can feel empowered and has the tools at hand to contribute and help building and making these tools and frameworks available to people. So I'm using the book in that sense as a conversation starter on this point with colleagues across industries, really. And I'm realizing that making the access to data and building data capabilities and knowledge is essential. Specifically, an important step in my journey was also the decision to open the door for broad cooperation in an open source way, which for another is an important question. Especially, in my case, I was contributing to an academic series, and the academic series also was contributing royalties to an association. So opening the door to actually put all the manuscript on an open source way and help grow professionally platforms that advocate for that open source knowledge and sharing of data methods is definitely a key area of interest of mine, and I think is the real tool to get more sustainability education out there.
And I understand this has led to a pretty exciting engagement with the University of Chicago. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Okay. This is another very, very, very exciting, very, very, very exciting upside from writing the book. The School of Professional Studies at University of Chicago is about to launch their very first course in sustainable business management this fall. And I will be joining them as an adjunct instructor to lead that effort as their very first course. So it will be offered in hybrid format to working professionals, which is, again, what I was hoping for from the beginning, and will target both English and Spanish speaking professionals. And they will be sharing an 8-week journey on the green economy, on concepts such as circularity to digitization of sustainability information, and also how to drive change within their organizations wherever they are in the world. And that's the part that inspires me the most.
Wonderful. So our audience for this podcast, they're kind of two types of people. There are people who've written a book and they're looking for understanding how can they best use it. But then we have a segment of people who have maybe considered reading a book or writing a book, but haven't yet taken that leap. For those who have considered writing a book but haven't done so, what advice would you give to them?
First off, I would say start writing down ideas. Whether as utilizing a voice note on your mobile device or a sketch, or a note that keeps floating in your mind, and keep fleshing them out up until they find a home. And usually a home, I say a whiteboard. And I think once you start recognizing trends and think about why your voice is needed and to whom, then it's really time to go write with intent and with the goal of having your book in people's hands so they can benefit from it and they can learn from that. I think the biggest mistake is never to write because we are unsure if our ideas will be useful and to whom. So starting with that is important, but also again, this idea of having a whiteboard and flashing ideas out and storing them, putting them someplace is better than just keeping in our heads, which only leads to headaches, possibly.
Absolutely. Alessia, what's the best way for people to learn more about the work that you're doing and to potentially reach out to you if they're interested in connecting around your work?
Well, the Impact Challenge is a beautiful website, and it's theimpactchallengebook.com. And it has a contact form that will reach me immediately. So you also list all the events I'm participating to and talking about the book or specific areas I cover in the book. Many have also online access to the recording, so they can be actually reshared over time. And they also include book clubs where the Impact Challenge is being featured, so you can actually join it and share that with others. It also contains a monthly blog, which I love because it keeps my audience up to speed with my work.
Wonderful. And we're going to make sure to include that in the show notes so that people can easily reference it. Alessia, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. The work that you're doing is fascinating and it's so important. And it's been really interesting to learn more about your authorship journey. So thank you again.
Thank you, Scott.
As we wrap up this episode of the Entrepreneur to Author podcast, remember, now is the time. Time to write, time to publish, and time to grow. I'm Scott McMillan. Until next time.
This is Story Studio Network.